The day Naomi Beckett arrived in Dustcreek, Texas, the town smelled like gunpowder, horse sweat, and something she could not yet name, the particular perfume of a place where people came to either remake themselves or get buried trying. It was the spring of 1878, and the land was cracked and gold, and enormous in a way that made a person feel both small and strangely alive. Naomi stepped down from the stagecoach with a single carpetbag in her hand, and a jaw set firmly enough to suggest she had not come this far to be broken by anything. She was 24 years old, with dark brown hair that the wind immediately conspired against, and eyes the color of amber glass when the sun came through it, warm and clear, and capable of seeing straight through a person if they gave her half a reason to look. She had come from St. Louis, where she had spent the last 3 years keeping books for a dry goods merchant who paid her half what he would have paid a man and thanked her for it besides. She had come because her father had written her a letter 6 months prior, breathless with the news that he had staked a claim on 40 acres just east of Dustcreek, and that the land was good and the well was deep, and all he needed was his daughter beside him to make it a home. And then, 2 months after that letter, a second one had arrived, this one written by a neighbor, informing her that Elijah Beckett had been thrown from his horse during a flash flood, and that the 40 acres were hers now if she wanted them. She wanted them. Not because she had no grief, she had plenty of it, carried quietly in her chest like a stone she kept forgetting was there, until she turned a certain way and felt its full weight, but because grief without purpose was just suffering, and Naomi Beckett had never been the suffering kind. The main street of Dustcreek was a long strip of sun-bleached wood and packed earth, lined with a general store, a livery stable, a barber shop, a saloon with a crooked sign, a church with a straighter one, and a building at the far end with a tin star nailed above the door that read Sheriff's Office in black painted letters. She noticed all of it the way she noticed most things, quickly, thoroughly, filing details away for later use. What she also noticed, because it was impossible not to, was the man leaning against the post outside the sheriff's office. He was tall in the unhurried way of men who had stopped trying to impress anyone, with dark hair beneath a worn tan hat and the kind of face that had been weathered into something more interesting than conventional handsomeness. He had a Marshal's badge pinned to his chest, catching the light like a small star, and his arms were crossed in a posture that managed to be both relaxed and watchful at the same time. He was looking at the new arrival. She could feel it with an expression she could not entirely read from this distance, though it did not appear to be unwelcoming. His name was Marshal Conroy, and he had been the Marshal of Dustcreek for 4 years, and before that he had spent 2 years as a deputy in Abilene, and before that he had grown up on a cattle ranch outside of San Antonio, where he had learned to ride before he could properly read, and to read a man's intentions before he could be read himself. He was 31 years old and had come to a kind of peace with the solitude that the job tended to produce, though calling it peace was perhaps generous. It was more of an arrangement, a practical understanding. He did the work. The work kept him occupied. Occupied was close enough to content. He had been informed, as marshals are informed of such things, that a young woman would be arriving on the 11 o'clock stage to take possession of Elijah Beckett's claim. He had also been asked by the county land office to make sure the property was secure before she arrived, which he had done 2 days prior, riding out to check that the fence lines were intact and the well was clean and the small house her father had built was weathertight. He had done this professionally and without any particular anticipation. He met strangers every week. The work required it. But there was something in the way she stepped down from that coach straight-backed, unhesitating, looking at the town with the focused attention of someone who intended to understand it, that caught his eye in a way he had not expected and could not immediately explain. He pushed off the post and crossed the street toward her before he had fully decided to do so. "Miss Beckett," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm Marshal Conroy. Welcome to Dustcreek." She looked at him with those clear amber eyes and extended her hand. Insent. Louis, women of her station did not generally shake hands with men they had just met, but she had decided, somewhere between the Missouri border and the Texas dust, that she was going to be a different kind of woman in a different kind of place, and that seemed as good a place as any to start. "Thank you, Marshal," she said. "I hope the town is as welcoming as its lawman." He shook her hand. She had a firm grip, he noticed, the kind that came from real work. And there was a brief, unremarkable moment that was nevertheless somehow both brief and unremarkable in a way that registered differently than the many brief and unremarkable moments that preceded it. He let go of her hand. She adjusted the strap of her carpet bag. "I can take you out to your father's property when you're ready," he said. "You'll want to get settled before dark." "I'll want to see the land office first," she said, "and then the general store to arrange delivery of some supplies, and then yes, I'd be grateful for the escort." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am." And there was something in the way he said it, not deferential but genuinely responsive, as if he had registered the specificity of her plan and adjusted to it, that she noticed and filed away with everything else. The land office took 20 minutes. The general store took 40, partly because the proprietor, a stout, cheerful man named Henderson, had a great many opinions about what a woman setting up a homestead on 40 acres would need, and Naomi had a great many counter-opinions, and the negotiation between them was thorough. Marshal waited outside, leaning against the hitching post, not impatiently. He had learned long ago that impatience was a form of waste. When she emerged, she had arranged a delivery for the following morning and had, he could tell from the slight satisfaction in her expression, gotten better terms than Henderson had initially offered. "Ready," she said. He had a horse saddled for her, a steady bay mare from the livery named Clover, on the reasoning that a woman arriving by stagecoach was unlikely to have brought her own mount. He had been right. He watched her approach the mare without hesitation, run a hand along the horse's neck in the quiet greeting of someone comfortable with animals, and mount with the ease of a person who had grown up riding, not the cautious efficiency of someone who had learned it later. "You ride well," he said. "My father taught me," she said, and something crossed her face briefly, not quite a shadow, more like the memory of light before she settled it back to neutral. "He was a good teacher." They rode out of town on the East Road, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was the easy kind, the kind that does not need to be filled. The land rolled out around them, pale grass and red earth and the long blue sky that seemed to go on forever in this part of Texas, as if God had simply run out of ceiling and decided to extend. "How long had your father been here?" Marshal asked. 8 months, she said. He had been a school teacher in St. Louis. He wanted different work. Outdoor work. He said he was tired of rooms. She paused. He was 61. I worried about him starting over at that age, but he was genuinely happy here. His letters were different, more himself somehow. More the way he used to be when I was a girl, before my mother died, and the happiness went out of him for a long while. Marshal said nothing for a moment, listening. "I'm glad he had those 8 months," she added, and the simplicity of it, the way she contained the whole complicated arithmetic of grief and gratitude in that one sentence, was something he registered without quite knowing what to do with it yet. Her father's claim was a modest piece of land with a small creek running along its southern edge, hence the town's name, a stand of cottonwood trees, 40 acres of grass that would grow things if properly tended, and a 2-room house built solidly if simply, with a front porch and a stone chimney and a window facing east so the morning light would come in on whoever woke first. Someone had swept the porch recently. Marshal had swept it himself 2 days ago before he had known anything about her except her name. He did not mention this. She walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the windowsills, the edge of the iron stove, as if reading the place with her hands. He stood in the doorway, giving her the space to do it. "He built this himself?" she asked. "With help from the Whitmore brothers who farm about 3 miles north, They're good neighbors. They'll help you if you need it. I'll introduce myself tomorrow, she said. She stood at the east window looking out at the light on the grass. Then she turned around and looked at him with something direct and uncomplicated in her expression. Thank you, Marshal Conroy, for coming out here, for making the ride. It's my job, he said, and then, because that felt insufficient, he added, but it's also just the right thing to do. Your father was well liked here. People were sorry to lose him. She nodded. And then, quickly, before it could develop into something requiring acknowledgement, she changed the subject by asking him about the water quality of the creek and whether it was reliable in summer, and he answered her. And they walked back out onto the porch. And the late afternoon light poured gold across everything, and he found himself in no particular hurry to return to town. He made himself go anyway. Riding back along the east road, the settling dust of her property behind him, he told himself with perfect honesty that she was a capable, interesting woman who had come to a difficult place under difficult circumstances and would probably do fine. He told himself this was the entirety of his assessment. He was mostly convinced of it. He was back at her property the next morning before the Henderson delivery arrived, which he could not have explained entirely to himself, except that he had told the Whitmore brothers about their new neighbor and thought someone familiar to her should be present when strangers showed up with a wagon. This was a reasonable explanation. He held to it. Her name, as it turned out, was less well suited to being a stranger than almost anyone he had ever met. By the time the Henderson delivery was unloaded and stacked, and the brothers had gone home for their noon meal, she knew the names of both Whitmore's sons, their wives, the number of cattle each of them ran, and which of the two had the better vegetable garden. She had also established that she intended to grow a kitchen garden herself, that she had a working knowledge of both irrigation and crop rotation, and that she was looking for someone to help her clear the south field before the planting season was too far advanced. The younger Whitmore brother, Tom, who was 26 and uncomplicated in the best possible way, said he could spare 2 days the following week. She thanked him in a way that was warm without being effusive and practical without being cold. Marshal spent most of this time doing what marshals do. He helped unload the wagon when an extra pair of hands was needed. He identified which fence post on the east boundary needed replacing and said he would come back with the materials, and he made a note of a door hinge that was loose and told her where to get the right size bolt from Henderson's. She wrote none of this down. She remembered all of it. You don't need to keep coming back to check on me, she told him at the end of that second morning when they were standing by the well and the delivery wagon was disappearing back toward town in its own small cloud. She said it without sharpness, more as a simple observation delivered to the correct person. I know, he said, equally simply. There was a pause. I don't mind if you do, though, she said. Keep coming back. He looked at her. She was looking at the well, adjusting the rope on the bucket with the focused attention she gave to most physical tasks, and there was a slight color in her face that could have been the heat of the morning sun or could have been something else, and he decided not to press the question. Good, he said. He came back with the fence post materials 3 days later. She was in the process of planting the kitchen garden, on her knees in the earth, her hair escaping its pins in the way it always seemed to when she was working, and she looked up at him over her shoulder with a dirt-smudged cheek and an expression of uncomplicated welcome that hit him somewhere in the chest with quiet force. They fixed the fence post together. She held it level while he packed the earth around it, and they were close enough that he could smell dust and something like rose water and the good clean smell of honest work, and he talked about the fence posts more thoroughly than fence posts strictly required as a result. She appeared to understand this without requiring him to say so, which he appreciated. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed unremarked upon, unannounced, simply present. He rode out to her property 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes with a practical purpose and sometimes without one. She always had something she was working on: the garden, the fence lines, a repair to the roof where a shingle had gone soft, the slow project of learning what the land wanted from her, and what she could reasonably ask of it in return. He helped when help was wanted and watched when it was not, and talked when she was in the mood for conversation and was quiet when she was not. What surprised him was how much he had to say when she asked him things. He was not a man who talked a great deal about himself. The job had taught him the value of listening, and he had perhaps overcorrected, because it had been years since anyone had asked him the right questions in the right way, and he had felt the pull to answer honestly. She asked about his family, his time in Abilene, what he thought was the hardest thing about the work he did. The distance, he said, the first time she asked that last question. They were sitting on her porch in the evening light, each with a cup of coffee she had made on the iron stove. Good coffee, strong and dark, one of her considerable domestic skills. You see what people need, and you can enforce the law and keep the peace, but you can't always fix the thing underneath it. The poverty, the grief, the feeling that this country promised them something and hasn't delivered it yet. She was quiet for a moment, turning her cup in her hands. "Do you think it will," she said, "deliver it?" "I think some people it does," he said slowly. "And for others the promise was never meant for them. And that's a wrong that the law is not always well designed to address." She looked at him, then with an expression he was beginning to recognize, a kind of close attention that meant she was revising her understanding of something, filing it in a different place than she had initially put it. "I think that's one of the most honest things I've heard anyone say about this country," she said. He shrugged, slightly uncomfortable with the directness of the compliment. "Doesn't mean I've stopped trying," he said. "I know," she said, and there it was again, that quality of seeing past the surface of him with a directness that should have been unnerving and was instead something closer to relieving. "That's why I said it." He was well past the point of pretending this was a professional arrangement. He was also not quite sure how to cross the distance from here to wherever here was going, because Naomi Beckett was not a woman you were careless with, and the work of being careful was different from the work he was accustomed to doing. It required a different kind of attention, a different kind of patience. Meanwhile, the town was developing its own opinions. Dustcreek was small enough that everyone knew everything, and large enough that some people minded their own business, and others did not. The ones who did not mind their business were largely benign, the widowed misses Farris, who ran the church auxiliary and had begun to regard Naomi's arrival with the warm, purposeful interest of someone who had been waiting for exactly this addition to the community, and Henderson at the general store, who had decided within a week of her first visit that she was the finest customer he had ever had, and therefore treated her like visiting royalty, and old Pete Dunmore at the livery, who had noticed that the Marshal had been riding the East Road considerably more than his official duties required, and had mentioned this observation to his wife, and then to approximately 11 other people. The ones who were less benign were, for the most part, not truly malevolent either. They were more in the category of inconvenient. Chester Dolan was in this category. He was 38, which was not old, and owned the 200 acres adjacent to Naomi's 40, and had apparently held a loose expectation that Elijah Beckett's death would result in the land being sold at a reasonable price to a reasonable neighbor, meaning himself. The arrival of Naomi disrupted this expectation, and he had processed the disruption by calling on her 3 times in as many weeks to inquire whether she had considered selling. He was not rude about it. He was polite in the deliberately heavy way of men who believe their politeness is a form of pressure. He came with his hat in his hand and his voice careful, and his eyes moving over her fence lines and her garden and her house in a way that was assessing rather than admiring. The first time, she told him the land was not for sale. The second time, she told him the same thing. The third time, she told him she had given him the same answer twice, and expected the third time to be sufficient, and that she appreciated his neighborliness, but hoped they could proceed on the basis of actual neighbors, rather than on the basis of a transaction she had no interest in completing. He took himself off in a manner that was not quite gracious. She told Marshal about it that same afternoon, when he came by to check the progress of the South Field clearing, which Tom Whitmore had helped her begin and which was going well, and he listened with the particular quality of attention that meant he was both registering what she was saying and holding himself carefully back from an immediate response. "Dahlin's a land accumulator," he said. "He's been at it for years. Not illegal. Not entirely pleasant, but not illegal." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to do anything official, I just thought you should know." He looked at her. "Why did you think that?" She met his eyes. "Because you come out here often enough that it seemed fair to keep you informed." There was a quality to the silence that followed that was different from their usual comfortable silences, denser, warmer, charged with something that had been building incrementally over the past several weeks, and had now arrived at a state of impossible ignorability. Marshal set down the fence post he had been unnecessarily carrying and said, "Naomi." He had not called her that before. He had been careful with her name, keeping the formal Miss Beckett between them like a measured distance. She turned to face him fully. "I come out here because I want to," he said. Because I want to see you. I want to know how the South Field is progressing, and whether the east fence held, and what you think about the creek levels. And I know that those are all just excuses to come and sit on your porch in the evening and drink your very good coffee. And I know you know that. And I'm not sure what to do with that except say it outright, because you're the kind of person who deserves things said outright." She was quiet for long enough that he wondered if he had said too much, moved too fast, misread the whole arrangement. Then she said, "I came out here with 40 acres and a dead father and a life I'd been running from for 3 years, and I told myself the most important thing was to build something steady, something mine, and that I had no room for anything else." She paused. "I've been revising that opinion for the last several weeks." "Toward what?" he said, and his voice was quieter than he intended. "Toward the idea that maybe building something steady doesn't have to mean building it alone," she said, "if the other person is steady themselves." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm working on it," he said, which was more honest than confident, and she seemed to appreciate the honesty. She stepped forward and closed the last of the distance between them, reached up and straightened the brim of his hat in a gesture so natural it seemed like something that had always been hers to do, and said, "So am I." He took her hand when she lowered it, and they stood like that in the afternoon light in the South Field with the cottonwood trees casting long shadows across the pale grass, and it was not dramatic or spectacular. It was simply true, which was better. He did not kiss her that day. He was still being careful. But there was a new quality to the evenings on her porch after that, a settled quality, a sense of things properly named and therefore properly owned. And when he rode back to town each night, he rode more slowly than he had before, and it had nothing to do with the road. It was Mrs. Ferris who suggested, approximately 3 weeks later, that the Marshal had been spending considerable time on the East Road, and shouldn't they expect an announcement before too long? And the general opinion of Dustcreek, with the exception of Chester Dahlin and a few others, was that this would be a very fine thing indeed. The announcement, as it happened, was preceded by something more immediately pressing, as things in Dustcreek tended to be, because the town, while not violent by the standards of the time, was not entirely peaceful either, and the spring of 1878 brought with it a variety of troubles that no amount of good intentions could entirely prevent. The first trouble was the drought. It came gradually, the way droughts do, the creek dropping by inches each week, the grass going from pale gold to pale yellow to a color that was not quite a color at all, and Naomi, who had been researching irrigation techniques in a borrowed agricultural manual, began to worry about the kitchen garden and the South Field and the well, all of which were dependent on the creek. She talked to the Whitmore brothers about it. She talked to other homesteaders she had met. There were 4 or 5 within reasonable distance, including an older Mexican family named Reyes who had been on their land for 15 years, and whose knowledge of drought management was far more extensive and practical than anything the agricultural manual had to offer. She began riding out to the Rays' property regularly, and the grandmother, Alina, who was 70 years old and spoke English with a precision that put most native speakers to shame, taught her everything she knew about reading the land and managing water and waiting out the seasons without despair. She told Marshal about these visits with a warmth and specificity that he found he loved about her, the way she talked about Alina Rays, not with the careful politeness some people used when discussing families who had been on this land before the settlers came, but with genuine admiration and a frank acknowledgement that what she was learning was not new knowledge, only new to her. She said something interesting, Naomi told him one evening on the porch, the sunset orange and wide over the dry grass. She said that the hardest thing for newcomers to learn is that the land doesn't care what you want from it. You have to learn what it needs first. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. That's true of people too, he said. She looked at him with a small smile. Is that your way of asking me something? Maybe, he said. I've been thinking about asking you something for a few weeks now. Then ask it, she said simply. He set down his cup and turned toward her on the porch step. The evening light was the color of amber, the color of her eyes, and he had no particular talent for flowery language, so he said what he meant as plainly as he could. I have been happier these past 2 months than I have been in longer than I can accurately say. I come out here and you're in the garden or fixing something or reading Alina Rays' advice in that agricultural manual with your feet up on the porch rail, and the sight of you here, like this, is the best part of every day. I am not a man who says things like that easily, but you make easy what isn't, and I would like, if you're willing, to spend a great deal more of my life out here on this porch with you. Officially. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see the emotion moving through her face, not sadness, but something full, the way a room fills with light when a door opens. That is the least flowery proposal I have ever heard, she said, and her voice was unsteady with something that was absolutely not tears, except that it was also absolutely tears. I can be more flowery, he said. I am willing to be significantly more flowery. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep, and reached across and took his hand the way she had taken it in the south field. Don't you dare, she said. It was perfect. They announced it to Mrs. Ferris the next morning, which was the most efficient method of informing the town, and the town, or the greater part of it, received the news with genuine happiness. Old Pete Dunmore from the livery said he had seen it coming since the first week, and his wife said he had told her so, and Henderson at the general store gave them both peppermints from a jar on the counter with the atmosphere of a man dispensing blessings. Chester Dolan was less festive. He appeared at the sheriff's office 2 days after the announcement, not to congratulate anyone, but to deliver what he characterized as a practical observation. That the Beckett claim, now potentially tied up in a Marshal's domestic arrangements, was likely to be an administrative complication, and that he was still prepared to offer a fair price. Marshal listened to him with the patient courtesy of a man who had heard a great many things he did not want to hear, and had learned to receive them without visible irritation. Mr. Dolan, he said, when Dolan had finished, Miss Beckett owns that property free and clear. What she chooses to do with it is entirely her own business, and I'll remind you that pressuring a property owner is not activity I look favorably upon in my county. Dolan left with his hat on and his goodwill nowhere in evidence, and Marshal made a note in the back of his mind to keep an eye on the situation. The drought peaked in July. The creek dropped to a thin ribbon, and 3 of the homesteads within 20 miles lost their summer gardens entirely. Naomi's fared better than most, because she had implemented Alina Rays' irrigation methods in May. Shallow channels dug between the rows, water drawn from the well in the cooler morning hours, stones laid between the plants to hold the moisture in the soil. It was painstaking work, and she did it with the focused stubbornness that characterized her approach to most obstacles, And when the corn came in modest but real, she drove a portion of it out to the Whitmore brothers and the two other homesteaders who had lost the most, because that was what you did. She and Marshall were married on a Saturday in August in the Dustcreek church, with the cottonwood trees outside throwing spotted shade and the temperature considerable and nobody complaining about it. Mrs. Ferris organized the reception, which was held in the churchyard, and which involved a substantial quantity of food contributed by the community in a spirit of collective generosity. Elena Reyes came with her family and stood to the side in a way that was dignified and self-contained until Naomi went specifically to her and brought her into the center of things, because Naomi Beckett, Naomi Conroy, as of approximately 11 o'clock that Saturday morning, was not the kind of woman who left the people who mattered to her standing at the edges. The ceremony itself was brief and sincere, which suited both of them. The minister, a careful, kind man named Reverend Fields, asked them the usual questions, and they answered in the usual way. And when Marshall looked at her in her cream-colored dress, with the afternoon light making her eyes the color of everything warm, he had the distinct and settling feeling of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was traveling toward, but recognizes the moment he gets there. She stood with her shoulder against his during the reception, occasionally talking to this neighbor or that, occasionally turning to say something to him in a low voice that was just for him, and the feel of her next to him solid, real, present, was a thing he understood he had been missing without knowing what it was called. They spent their first married night at the Beckett claim, which was now both of their claim, in the house her father had built with its east-facing window, and the summer dark came in soft and warm around them, and the cottonwood trees moved in the slight breeze, and everything was exactly as it should be. The second trouble came in September, when three strangers rode into Dustcreek on horses that had been ridden hard and stopped at the saloon and stayed too long. Marshall knew the type, not because he was judgmental but because experience had made him accurate, and he kept an eye on them from across the street until the eye-keeping became a direct conversation in which he let them know, in the specific pleasant way of a man who is also capable of being thoroughly unpleasant, that the county was peaceful, and he intended to keep it that way. Two of the three took his meaning and moved on. The third, a lean, sharp-faced man named Cal Avery who had the look of someone carrying a long grievance, stayed an extra day and made inquiries about the properties on the East Road, and specifically about who had water rights on what. Marshall found this out from Henderson, who found most things out, and went to speak with Naomi about it the same day. She was in the garden, harvesting the last of the beans, and she listened to him with the steady attention she gave to information she needed to process. "Water rights," she said. "My father's claim papers specify rights to the creek along the south boundary." "I know," he said. "I've read the papers, they're valid." "But if someone is sniffing around, if Dahlin has brought in someone to press the issue, can he contest the rights legally?" she said. "He can try," he said. "It would be a county court matter. I don't think he has a strong case, but it would cost you time and money to defend, and some people use that as the pressure." She was quiet for a moment, turning a bean pod in her hands. "What do you recommend?" "I'm going to ride out to Dahlin's place tomorrow and have a conversation," he said. "And then I'm going to make sure the county registrar's office has current copies of everything on file." "I'll go to the county registrar myself," she said. "I have my own copies. My father was meticulous." "I know you will," he said, and there was a simplicity in the way he said it, a complete confidence, not the performance of confidence but the real kind, that she felt somewhere deep and quiet. The conversation with Dahlin was direct and final. Marshall drove out to his property on a clear September morning and found him mending fence on the north side of his land, or rather, found him watching a hired hand mend fence, which was its own kind of information. He stated, plainly and without anger, that the Conroy property's water rights were legally established, that any attempt to contest or interfere with them would be addressed through the county court and through his office, and that any individual employed by Dahlin who was found harassing or threatening the Conroys or their neighbors would be in direct violation of several specific laws that Marshal was prepared to enforce. Dahlin listened with the expression of a man who has miscalculated something and is in the process of adjusting. Cal Avery left the county 2 days later. Marshal did not follow him out of town, but he watched until the figure on horseback was fully over the horizon. The autumn settled in, and with it the particular gold of October in East Texas. The cottonwood leaves turning, the light going lower and slower, the evenings coming earlier and sitting longer on the porch a necessity rather than a choice. Naomi began teaching herself to use the rifle that had been in her father's house, a model 1873 Winchester, well-maintained, and Marshal watched her practice on the fence post in the back field with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose wife has a better eye than he expected and is honest enough to enjoy the fact. She got the technique in about 2 weeks and improved consistently after that, because consistency was her nature. He told her so. She told him it was just mathematics. He said he had never thought of marksmanship as mathematical. She said that most things were, if you paid attention. He thought about that for several days afterward, which was the effect she often had on him, not because she was trying to be profound, but because she saw things clearly enough that clarity was the natural outcome. The first real winter brought them close together in the specific physical way of people sharing a small house in cold weather. The stove burning from early morning, the window frosted at its edges, the world contracted to the warm circle of their own making. He was surprised, in a way he had not anticipated, by how much he liked it. He was a man who had spent years being self-sufficient, who had built his whole professional life on a kind of competent isolation, and he had not understood until now that self-sufficiency and isolation were different things, and that what he had been practicing was more of the second dressed up as the first. She was reading in the evenings now. She had ordered books from the county library in San Marcos, history and agriculture and fiction, and she read with the lamp pulled close and her feet under her. And sometimes she would read him passages that struck her as particularly true or beautiful or funny, and they would talk about them. And the conversations they had were the kind he had never had before, reaching into things he had not known he had opinions about until she asked him, and he discovered he did. He told her, one January evening with the wind outside and the fire inside, that he was glad she had come to Dustcreek. It seemed like an insufficient thing to say, but he said it anyway. She looked at him over her book. "I thought you were going to say something more elaborate than that," she said. "I'm not an elaborate man," he said. "No," she agreed, "but you're a very good one, and I have come to feel that's considerably more important." He held that in the warmth of the room for a long time after she had returned to her book, and felt it settle into him with the permanence of things that are simply true. By March, she told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the morning, standing in the kitchen while the coffee was coming up on the stove. In the same direct way she told him most things, not dramatically, but with the full weight of it present in her expression, a fullness that was partly joy and partly something larger than joy, the particular enormity of a life changing in the most fundamental way. He was very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and held her, carefully at first and then completely, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held in the way she rarely let herself be anything fully, without reservation. The composed and practical Naomi Beckett entirely dissolved in the warm fact of this. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I'm wonderful," she said, muffled. "I'm terrified, both things." "That sounds right," he said. The news spread through Dustcreek with the efficiency of all such news in small towns, and the response was warm and immediate. Mrs. Farris brought a quilt she had apparently been making in anticipation of exactly this occasion, which Naomi accepted with genuine movedness. Elena Reyes came with her daughter and her granddaughter and sat with Naomi on the porch and talked for 2 hours about things that women knew and needed to know. And Marshal, who had come home in the middle of this to find his porch occupied by 3 generations of Ray's women and his wife looking more at peace than he had perhaps ever seen her, turned his horse around and found a reason to be elsewhere for another hour, because some conversations were not for him, and he was wise enough to know it. The summer was a good one, not too dry, the creek running well, the garden excellent, Naomi moving through the months with the focused energy she brought to everything, adapting to the changing dimensions of her body with pragmatic good humor and occasional candid complaints that he received with seriousness and addressed as practically as he could. He did more of the heavy work. She accepted this to a degree, and then set her own limits on what she would accept help with, which he respected, because one of the foundational truths of their marriage was that she was fully capable of knowing what she needed, and he was not required to decide for her. He also worried, in the quiet way that people who love very much worry, not catastrophically but constantly, a low, steady awareness of her well-being running under everything else he did. She knew he worried. She did not tell him to stop. She understood the distinction between worry born of love and worry born of control, and what he had was emphatically the former. Their son was born in November, on a cold, clear morning with the cottonwood trees bare against a pale sky. He was delivered by the town's doctor, a serious and competent man named Dr. Amos Hale, with Alina Reyes present as well because Naomi had asked her to be, and Marshal waiting on the porch in the cold with his hands clasped, and his whole carefully constructed equanimity entirely unavailable to him. When Dr. Hale opened the door and said, "You have a boy, Marshal, and they're both fine," Marshal sat down on the porch step, simply sat, the way his legs had decided for him, and held his face in his hands for a moment before he pulled himself together. Inside, Naomi was propped against the pillows with her hair down, and her face showing the specific exhaustion of something enormous that had been accomplished, and in her arms was a red-faced, violently alive small person who was making his opinions about the world known with considerable volume. She looked up at Marshal when he came through the door, and the expression on her face, the particular complicated tenderness of a woman holding something she cannot believe is real, was a thing he carried in his chest for the rest of his life. "He's loud," she said. "That's a good thing," Dr. Hale said, gathering his bag. "That's a very good thing," Marshal agreed, and sat beside her on the bed and looked at his son with the dazed wonder of a man discovering that there are larger things in life than he had accounted for, and reached out one finger to the small clenched fist, which after a moment unclenched and wrapped around it. They named him Elijah James Conroy. Elijah for her father, James for Marshall's, who had died of a fever when Marshall was 12, and whom he had carried in his mind ever since as the quiet, steady model of how a man ought to conduct himself. He told Naomi about his father more than he had ever told anyone about him, over those first weeks of their son's life, in the particular intimacy of the night hours when the baby was fed and quiet, and they were both awake from necessity, and talked in the way of people who have run out of their usual reserve. She listened the way she always listened to him, with her whole attention, not filling the silence before he was ready to fill it himself. He told her about the ranch, about his father's hands, about the particular smell of the horses in the morning, and the way his father could read whether coming 3 days out and was never wrong. She told him about her own father stories she had not told yet, smaller and funnier stories than the ones she had led with, about Elijah Beckett's complete inability to cook anything except cornbread, about his habit of collecting interesting rocks and lining them up on windowsills, about the way he had said good night to her every night of her childhood, the exact same words in the exact same voice. Marshal listened to all of it and felt the particular privilege of a person who has been trusted with the whole of someone, not the edited presentation but the real thing, and understood that this was what he had been looking for on every road in every county since he was old enough to go looking. The winter passed gently and the spring came again, and Elijah grew with the focused energy of all small things in good soil, and life on the Conroy property, which was now undeniably, entirely, unreservedly a home rather than a claim, settled into the rhythms of a real and working place. Marshal continued his work as Marshal, riding the county with the same steady attention he had always given it, but with a different quality of orientation now, the center of his compass fixed on a point east of town that he returned to each evening with a certainty that had no bottom to it. He mediated disputes between homesteaders, settled water rights questions, tracked a stolen horse across 3 counties, and returned it with the patient thoroughness that characterized his professional life, and spent the quieter days doing exactly the kind of thing that young Deputy Mike Slater, who had come to work for him the previous fall, watched with the slightly awed attention of someone learning by observation. Mike was 22, from Georgia, and had come west with ambitions that outpaced his experience, and Marshal was the kind of supervisor who met that combination with patience rather than impatience, teaching by doing, explaining the reasoning behind decisions, giving the young man responsibility in measures sized to his current capacity, and increasing it as the capacity grew. Naomi had met Mike twice and had given her opinion that he was genuine and trainable, which was her highest professional assessment of a person, and Marshal had agreed. Chester Dolan, for his part, had settled into a form of neighborhood that was not warm but was functional. He and Marshal encountered each other periodically at the county seat and exchanged the minimal courtesies of men who had a practical relationship and no personal affinity. Dolan had not attempted to press the water rights question again, and Marshal had filed the matter in the category of resolved, with the understanding that it remained there only so long as no one disturbed it. The following spring brought Naomi's second pregnancy, which she announced with the same morning kitchen directness as the first, and which Marshal received with the same stillness followed by complete holding, because it was the right response and he knew it. This time she was less frightened and more simply glad. The unknown had become the known, and the known was good, and she moved through the spring and summer with her particular quality of purposeful contentment. The kitchen garden larger this year, the corn in the south field coming in well, little Elijah toddling between the rows and investigating everything with the systematic curiosity that was, Marshal thought, entirely his mother's. Their second child was born in October, a girl this time, delivered again by Dr. Hale on a milder morning than her brother's arrival, with Alina Reyes present and Marshal on the porch in the fall sunshine with somewhat less catastrophic anxiety than the first time, though not significantly less. She was quieter than her brother from the first moment and dark-haired, and when Naomi held her and looked up at Marshal, they both felt the particular expansion of something already enormous becoming larger still, the precise discovery that love of this kind does not divide but multiplies. They named her Clara Rose Conroy. Rose for no one in particular except that it was the name Naomi had carried in her mind as the right name from some time before she could explain. Elijah met his sister with the suspicious neutrality of a 2-year-old encountering a rival, followed within 3 days by the complete possessive adoration that would define their relationship going forward. Clara, who followed him everywhere, Elijah, who endured it and secretly loved it, the two of them making a small, complete world of their own within the larger one. The year that Clara turned 1, Dustcreek grew. A railroad spur was extended to within 8 miles of town, and the practical effect was the arrival of new settlers at a rate the town had not previously experienced. 2 new families in the spring, 3 more by summer, a new schoolhouse proposed and funded by September, and with it the need for a teacher. Naomi had been running informal reading lessons for the 3 neighboring families' children since the previous year. It had started when the Whitmore boy's youngest, who was 8, had confessed to her over the fence that he could not read, and she had simply begun helping him, which led to his sister joining, and then 2 others. She had not called it teaching. She had called it reading together, When the schoolhouse committee asked her to consider the position of teacher, she sat with it for 3 days and then talked to Marshall about it the evening of the third day. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking it would be the most meaningful work I've ever done," she said. "And I'm thinking the children on this claim need their mother present, and I'm thinking those two things can possibly both be true at the same time, and I'm trying to figure out how." "What hours would the school run?" he said. She told him. Morning hours released before midday. He was quiet for a moment, running the arithmetic. "I can adjust my morning ride pattern," he said. "Mike can cover the north side. You can take the children to Alina in the morning and I'll bring them home at noon when I pass the Ray's place on my way to the East Road." She looked at him. "You would change your route." "My route is a practical decision," he said. "I make it. I can remake it." "Marshal Conroy," she said, with an expression that was warm and full and a little undone, "you are consistently the finest man I have ever known." He looked mildly embarrassed, in the way he always looked when she said things like that directly to him, which she enjoyed and therefore did regularly. "You're just saying that because I offered to change my patrol route," he said. "I am saying that for approximately 40 distinct reasons," she said, "of which the patrol route is only the most recent." She took the teaching position in September. She was excellent at it, which surprised no one who knew her. She had her father's gift for explanation, clear, patient, adjusted to the specific comprehension of each child, and something additional that was entirely her own, which was the ability to make a child feel that what they were learning was genuinely important, and that their particular way of understanding it was worth examining. By October, she had 11 students. By the following spring, she had 16. The schoolhouse became a center of the community in the way that schools do when they are run by people who understand their role. Marshall rode past it some mornings and heard the sound of voices inside recitation, sometimes singing, occasionally what sounded like vigorous debate about something, and felt the particular private satisfaction of a man whose life has arranged itself into exactly what it should be, more completely than he had any right to expect. Alina Reyes, in her 73rd year, fell ill in the winter. It was not sudden. Her health had been declining with the slow patience of great age, but the decline accelerated in December, and Naomi went to her 3 times a week, sitting with her, talking, bringing food from her kitchen, being present in the way that Alina had been present for Naomi in the early years. There was a quality of closing a circle in it, though Naomi did not think of it in those terms. She thought of it as love. The obligation of love toward the people who had given it freely when you needed it. Alina died in February, peaceful and surrounded by her family, and Naomi was present at the end, holding her hand, and the grief she carried afterward was the good kind, full of memory, full of gratitude, the grief of someone who had been genuinely known by the person they were mourning. The Reyes family, Alina's daughter Carmen, her son-in-law and their children, remained on their land and remained neighbors in the fullest sense. Marshal quietly ensured in the years following that the county land records for the Reyes property were in impeccable order, and that no one with land-accumulating tendencies developed ambitions in that direction. He mentioned this to no one because he had not done it for credit, and Naomi knew he had done it because she knew him completely, and she loved him the more for the doing and the not mentioning both. The children grew. Elijah was 5 when Clara was 3, and they were as different from each other as two people raised in the same place by the same people could be. Elijah steady and observant, with his father's watchfulness and his mother's precision. Clara expansive and determined, with her mother's directness and something extra that was entirely and specifically herself. She would be a force, Marshall thought, watching her argue her older brother into things with the patient, implacable certainty of someone who had simply already decided how things were going to go. He recognized this quality. He had first seen it stepping off a stagecoach in 1878. When Elijah was 6, he asked his father what it meant to be a marshal. They were in the barn together, tending the horses, which was their together time, the way reading was Clara's together time with Naomi. Marshal considered the question seriously because it was asked seriously. "It means being responsible for the peace of a place," he said. "Making sure that people who can't protect themselves have someone in their corner, making sure the law is applied the same way to everyone." "Is it?" Elijah asked. He was already asking precise questions, which was his mother's doing. Marshal was quiet for a moment. "Not always," he said. "Not as well as it should be. That's the work, trying to make it closer to what it ought to be than it was before you got there." Elijah considered this with the focused seriousness of 6. "Is that why you do it?" he said. "Partly," Marshal said. "And partly because it's what I know how to do, and doing what you know how to do well, really well, has its own satisfaction." Elijah nodded as if this made complete sense to him, which it apparently did, and went back to brushing the bay mare, who was a different bay mare from the one Naomi had ridden in from town on her first day. Clover had been returned to the livery years ago, but equally steady, which was what they looked for in a horse. The years settled into each other in the way of good years, not uneventful, because no real life is, but fundamentally sound, the ground beneath them firm and the horizon clear. There were hard seasons, a second drought, 2 years later, that tested the farm harder than the first, but Naomi's irrigation methods and her connections in the agricultural community meant they came through it without the losses that flattened several other homesteads. Marshal helped where he could and trusted her judgment when she disagreed with him, which she did occasionally and was usually right about. There was a winter when Clara was sick for 3 weeks with a fever that Dr. Hale monitored with the careful vigilance of a serious physician, and during those 3 weeks Marshal and Naomi maintained a cooperative steadiness for the children and the house and each other that was one of the forms their love took, not the romantic form, not the tender form, but the form of 2 people holding something precious together with both hands, refusing to let it go. Clara recovered, as children do, with the robust indifference of the young to how thoroughly they have frightened the people who love them. There was the year that Dustcreek got its own newspaper, a small weekly operation run by a young man from Austin named Davis who had strong opinions and a printing press, and who asked Naomi, in his second month in town, whether she would consider writing a column about agricultural topics for the homesteader community. She said she would think about it. She wrote it for 7 years. There was the year Mike Slater, now 27 and fully fledged as a deputy, married the youngest Whitmore daughter, and Marshal stood up as a witness and felt the quiet particular pleasure of seeing a young man he had invested time in step properly into his own life. Naomi cried at the ceremony, which she denied afterward, though the evidence was against her. And there was the evening, some years into all of it, a summer evening with the light going long and orange, and the children asleep, and the crickets starting up and the cottonwood trees moving in the slight warm wind, when Marshal came out onto the porch where Naomi was sitting with her cup of coffee and her feet on the rail, and he sat beside her, and they looked at the land together in the easy silence that had always been their native language. "I was thinking today," he said after a while, "about the day you arrived." "Which part of it?" she said. "The part where you stepped off the stagecoach," he said, straight-backed and organized and looking at the town like you were going to figure out every piece of it before dark. She smiled at the land. "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "You just didn't let it show." "I let it show eventually," she said. "Not the terror," he said. "The other thing." She turned her head to look at him. In the fading light she looked exactly like herself, not younger, not the 24-year-old from the stagecoach, but herself as she was now, fully, completely, every year of the life they had built together present in her face. He found this more beautiful than anything which he supposed was either sentiment or truth, and had decided long ago it was the latter. "The other thing," she said softly, "that you were going to be all right," he said. That whatever this place asked of you, you were going to meet it." "You could see that," she said. "From across the street," he said. She reached over and took his hand, the way she had taken it in the south field on that first real day, and they sat like that in the warm evening with the stars beginning and the land around them. Their land, 40 acres expanded now to 60, with the purchase of a strip along the north boundary 3 years prior, fenced and planted and known. And it was what it had always been beneath everything else. Beneath the practical arrangements and the hard seasons and the thousand specific decisions that made a life. Simply, profoundly, entirely true. Elijah appeared at the door in his nightclothes a moment later with the specific expression of a child who is 8 years old and theoretically in bed and has decided this is an unreasonable condition. "There's a cricket in my room," he said. "Go to sleep," his father said. "I cannot sleep with a cricket in the room," Elijah said with the considered gravity of someone presenting a legitimate legal argument. "Put it outside," his mother said. "It's dark," he said. "Light the lamp," she said. "Clara has the lamp," he said. "Clara is asleep," his mother said. "Clara is reading under the covers," he said, delivering this information with the cheerful precision of someone who has calculated that sharing the situation equally distributes the consequence. Marshal pressed his lips together against the expression that was trying to form on his face. He heard Naomi doing the same thing beside him. "Send Clara out here," he said, "and then light the lamp and relocate the cricket." Elijah considered the justice of this arrangement for approximately 2 seconds and then went back inside, satisfied with the outcome if not necessarily the method. A moment later Clara appeared on the porch with her dark hair loose and her book tucked under her arm, and the expression of someone who had anticipated this and was prepared to negotiate. She was 8 years younger than her brother and 3 years old, and she had the presence of someone considerably older than that, which had been true since roughly the moment she became aware that the world contained things she had opinions about. "Clara," Naomi said. "Mama," Clara said. "Bed," Naomi said. "The book is very good," Clara said, holding it up as evidence. "It will be equally good in the morning," her mother said, with the composed patience of a woman who had been a schoolteacher for 4 years and could outlast almost any child. Clara appeared to perform an internal calculation. Then she kissed her mother's cheek and her father's cheek in turn and went back inside, and they heard the faint sound of Elijah complaining about something to do with the lamp, and then quiet. Marshal exhaled. "They are exactly like you," he said. "They are nothing like me," Naomi said, with the pleasant serenity of a woman making an argument she does not expect to win and does not require to win. "Clara is entirely like you," he said. "She makes up her mind and then presents the decision as if it were a question. That is called diplomacy," she said. "That is called you," he said. She looked at him, and there was laughter in her face, and behind the laughter the same thing that had always been there, the steady warmth of a woman fully settled in her life, fully present in it, fully his in the only way that mattered, which was the way she had chosen and continued to choose every day. He kissed her, there on the porch with the stars out and the cottonwood trees moving and the children bickering quietly inside about a cricket, and she kissed him back with the ease of many years and the completeness of something that had never diminished, and the evening went on around them, enormous and quiet, and entirely their own. It was several years after that evening, years of school and harvest, and the particular education of watching 2 children become themselves, years of the newspaper column and the neighbors, and the steady work of a marshal who believed in the thing he was doing, that the town had its first proper celebratory picnic in honor of its 20 years of incorporation, and Naomi was asked to speak. She was not a woman who shrank from public speaking. She had been a schoolteacher for too long for that. She stood up in the churchyard with the cottonwood trees full and green above her, and the whole of Dustcreek gathered in the summer warmth, and she spoke about what she had found here, and what the place had given her, and what she believed it owed to the people who had been here before anyone with a deed in their pocket had arrived. And she said this last part with the particular directness that had always been her essential quality, and there was a silence after it that was thoughtful rather than resistant. Because she was known and trusted, and had earned the right to say the true thing. Marshal stood to the side and watched her and felt, with an immediacy that 20 years had not diminished at all, the same thing he had felt on the day she arrived, the sense of someone fully, powerfully, beautifully themselves. Elijah, who was 12 now, stood next to his father and watched his mother speak. He had his father's height already, his mother's eyes. "She's really good at that," he said quietly. "Yes," Marshal said. "Did you know she would be?" Elijah asked. "When she got here." Marshal thought about the stagecoach, the carpet bag, the straight back and the clear eyes and the hand extended for a handshake. "I knew something," he said. "I wasn't sure exactly what." Elijah considered this in the way he considered most things, quietly, thoroughly. "What did you think it was?" "I thought it was someone arriving," Marshal said. "I didn't know yet that she was arriving for me." Elijah was 12 and therefore obligated to receive this with a slight expression of aesthetic suffering. But he was also genuinely his parents' son, and the suffering only lasted a moment before something real and quiet came through underneath it. "That's actually kind of a good answer," he said. "Don't tell your mother I said something like that," Marshal said. "She'll be insufferable about it." "She will not," Elijah said. "She'll just smile and not say anything and then bring it up once, very precisely, at exactly the right moment 6 months from now." Marshal looked at his son. "You know her very well," he said. "I grew up watching you figure that out," Elijah said. Across the churchyard, Naomi had finished speaking. She was moving through the crowd now, talking to Alina Reyes's daughter Carmen, touching Clara's shoulder as she passed, accepting the greetings of neighbors with the warmth that was simply her. The genuine, undivided warmth of a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. She looked across the yard and found his eyes the way she always found his eyes, with the unerring accuracy of 20 years of practice, and smiled, not the public smile but the private one, the one that was for him specifically, the one that still moved something in him with the same clean force as the first time he had earned it. He smiled back. Clara appeared at his elbow, pulling his sleeve with the breezy directness that was her signature. "Papa," she said, "Tom Whitmore's youngest is saying the Conroy corn isn't as tall as the Whitmore corn this year, and I need you to come settle it." "I'm not settling agricultural disputes at the town picnic," he said. "Then I'll settle it myself," she said with perfect confidence. "Clara," he said, but she was already moving across the yard with the purposeful stride of her mother, and Elijah was watching her go with the expression of a 12-year-old who has been observing a force of nature his entire life and has made his peace with the fact. "She'll be fine," Elijah said. "She's 8, Marshal said. "She's Clara," Elijah said. "It's different," and it was. It was entirely, specifically different. As different as this life was from any life Marshal Conroy had imagined for himself in those years of riding county roads and sleeping in sparse rooms, and doing the work carefully in the absence of anything much to come home to. The difference was not quantifiable. It was simply everything. Naomi reached his side a few minutes later, with Clara in tow and the corn dispute apparently resolved to Clara's satisfaction, and she tucked herself against his arm in the way she had stood beside him for years, and they watched their children move through the summer afternoon of their town, among their neighbors on their land, and everything that had been built. The house with its east-facing window, the kitchen garden, the south field, the 40 acres extended to 60, the school, the column in the weekly paper. The 2 fierce and different and wonderful children, the 20 years of mornings and evenings on the porch with the coffee and the cottonwood trees. Everything was present. In this moment, the way all real things are present in the real moment. "What are you thinking?" she said. "About the East Road," he said. "About how many times I rode it." She looked up at him with the amber glass eyes that the years had not changed, not in what mattered. "Was it worth it?" she said, teasing gently. "Every trip," he said, "from the first day." She pressed her hand over his. The summer afternoon went on around them. The cottonwood trees moved in the breeze that always came from the north in July, and the land rolled out golden and enormous under the enormous sky, and the children were there, and the neighbors were there, and everything that had been built from 40 acres and a carpetbag and a handshake across a dusty street was there, and real and exactly as it should be. He held her hand. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. And in the particular warm light of that afternoon in Dustcreek, Texas, in the summer of 1898, 20 years from the day she had stepped off the stagecoach into a life neither of them had known they were waiting for. Everything was exactly, completely, and entirely whole.